Medieval punishments were, of course, absolutely savage. This isn't news, most of us already know this. What a lot of people don't know, though, is why. Some people think we were just more violent back then, or that punishment was actually a form of public entertainment. The reality is actually a bit more complicated. So, whether you're here to learn more about medieval culture, or you just want to get some gruesome details on the horrific punishments, you're in the right place, because today we're covering both. In fact, we'll start by taking a look at the punishment for high treason. People often say it's the worst punishment in history, but I think there's actually something worse that we'll be covering later on. But to break the ice, we'll take a look at being hung, drawn, and quartered. As you can probably tell, viewer discretion is advised. In 1305, William Wallace was on trial for his life. He was accused of treason since he had led a Scottish rebellion against the English king Edward I and lost. Wallace argued that since he was Scottish, he never formally recognised the English crown as his sovereign, which meant that he couldn't have committed treason since he never betrayed or rebelled against his own king, but merely took up arms against an occupying force. Unsurprisingly, this line of argument did not work, since 15 years earlier to this fact, the Treaty of Bergen had been signed, which formally recognised Edward I and the English crown as the sovereign of Scotland. It actually wouldn't matter what Wallace said at his trial, the decision had already been made that he was to be executed for treason. The trial was just a kind of showcase and a formality so that the king could look just. This is why Wallace's execution would begin within moments of his sentence. All the preparations had already been made. So, as soon as the gavel came down, he was stripped and tied to a horse which was made to run through the city from Westminster to Smithfield. As he was dragged through the city of London naked, he would have been subject to ridicule from the local townspeople and bashed across stones and other debris as his bare skin was scraped along the ground. Once he arrived at Smithfield, he was hung, but not in the sense of the word that we understand now, where you drop with a sudden snap as the rope is pulled tight around your neck. Instead, Wallace would be slowly lifted from the floor by the rope around his neck, meaning that his choking would be slow, painful, and ultimately non-lethal, which was precisely the point. This would be the first of a 3-step process. Interestingly, 300 years later, Guy Fawkes was sentenced to the exact same fate as Wallace, but he actually managed to throw himself over the gallows, breaking his neck instantly and dying in order to avoid the torment. And when you hear about what happens to Wallace, you'll understand that Fawkes made the right choice. As we said, Wallace would have been hung slowly. The entire process would have lasted about 10 to 30 minutes, as he alternated between being able to catch his breath on his feet and dangling from a rope that pulled tightly around his neck. The entire process was meant to do 3 things. Firstly, to cause immense pain, as the strain of his entire body weight dangling from just his neck, whilst also fighting for each and every breath, would have been extremely painful, as well as outright terrifying. Secondly, it was a process of humiliation, seeing a once great warrior reduced to something half his measure, dangling half naked, helpless, and waiting for death. Lastly, after 10 to 30 minutes of partial asphyxiation, the victim would be unable to resist whatever came next, which would be important because the process was as precise as it was brutal, and a victim who was kicking and thriving may end up accidentally killing themselves and getting off too easy. See, after his hanging and physical subjugation, Wallace would endure the second stage of his execution. A raging fire would be placed next to him while he was tied with his hands behind his back. As he collected his breath, one of his executioners approached with a scalpel and ran the blade from the bottom of his ribcage all the way down to his groin. And, with great care, a pair of hands would run down the incision, tugging and tearing his torso open like a pair of curtains. Wallace would have still been alive for this, and would have been able to look down and see as his body was opened like a book. Once open, his entrails would be delicately lifted out of his stomach, so as not to kill him, and dumped onto the fire. The last thing he would have smelt was his own burning intestines and bowels. At this stage, after being publicly hung and then disemboweled in slow motion, Wallace would begin to fade in and out of consciousness as he suffered extreme blood loss, oxygen deprivation, and of course, unthinkable physical and psychological trauma. At this climax of suffering and horror, the blade came down against his throat and severed his head from his body, ending his torment. His remains, however, had more to come, as he would be split into 4 pieces, or quartered, and sent away to various parts of the kingdom to warn anyone else who was considering following in his footsteps, although his head would remain in London as a symbol of the king's power and terrifying justice. The fact that Wallace's body was cut into several chunks and posted across the UK was not a mere accident of power projection, but a final religious snub. Now his body was no longer whole. He would be unable to stand and rise alongside the other dead whenever Judgment Day finally arrived. He was damned, both in death and in the afterlife. It's brutal. It's difficult to imagine the absolute terror that this must have induced into its victims, but also to the crowd that was watching. It was the ultimate sign of the ruling government's power. There are countless other punishment types just like this, and people spent a lot of creative energy on these kinds of executions. You also had impalement, burning at the stake, and honestly, countless other methods of cruelty. But why? Why do we see stuff like this then, and not anymore? What changed? Well, honestly, not much. I know that sounds like a really absurd thing to say, but these punishments that we hear about are really unusual cases. It wasn't an accident that both of the names I've mentioned so far, William Wallace and Guy Fawkes, are people you probably already heard of. And that's because these were once-in-a-generation events, and punishments like these were more of a political tool to show everyone what happened when you defy the king. They weren't a normal feature of law and order. Instead, it was a kind of human sacrifice for the sake of crown propaganda. In fact, during the research for this topic, I could only find 4 confirmed cases of this execution being performed in full throughout the whole of English history. There are loads of records of it being dished out, but lots of times the charge was dropped or reduced, or the execution didn't happen properly, and people were just hung until they were dead instead. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is just hundreds of brutal torture and execution methods that existed, so we can't just use being hung, drawn and quartered as an example. You had the rack, the Iron Maiden, thumb screws, the Spanish donkey, impalement and all kinds of nasties. But here's where things get interesting. None of them were actually used that much. In fact, a lot of what we consider to be typical law and order in medieval Europe is actually all made up. See, in the centuries immediately following the medieval era, England's religious landscape started to change, as it became more and more culturally Protestant, whilst most of mainland Europe remained Catholic. These new Protestant thinkers wanted to show that their new version of Christianity was much more civilised and humane than the Catholics who were still practising a backwards religion that belonged in the Dark Ages. And so there was a concerted effort to selectively choose which historical accounts were used and sensationalise any mention of torture or brutality, whilst also completely removing the context around each case. In the end, we just got this story that the medieval period, and by association the Catholic period, was arbitrarily violent, and that we're very lucky now to be Protestant and to have moved on from all that nastiness. This distortion of history then went into complete overdrive during the Victorian era, when the general public started taking an interest in history, and you had all kinds of museums and exhibitions popping up for the average person to attend and learn about their past. The Victorian era is of course defined by its love for the macabre, with Frankenstein, Dracula and Jekyll and Hyde being smash hits at the time. It's no coincidence then that during this period of fascination with history and horror, curators and writers were constantly exaggerating medieval torture methods and all the nasty stories that go along with them. One item of particular fascination was the Iron Maiden, which was a kind of upright coffin lined with spikes, which would be slammed shut to kill or torture whoever was inside. But there are no accounts of the Iron Maiden ever being used, at least not with the spikes. And then you also had the Spanish donkey, which is this kind of pyramid shape, and you'd have weights tied to your feet, and you'd be forced to sit on top of the pyramid, which would go inside you, and you'd get pulled down. Really nasty. Anyway, people in Victorian England were fascinated by this torture method. And again, it became a symbol of Catholic Inquisition in Europe. But the only trustworthy account that I've found of its use wasn't until the American Civil War, where we have soldiers complaining that it took them days to walk after the ordeal because of the horrific internal damage that would occur. But still, the American Civil War was an entire continent and centuries away from both medieval Europe and Victorian England. And then meanwhile, something that failed to capture the imagination of the Victorians was the wheel. even though it's far more brutal and was far more commonly used. It's sometimes known as the breaking wheel or the Catherine wheel, and funnily enough, even though the Protestants of England wanted to paint the Catholics as monsters, this style of punishment wouldn't become popular until the Protestants were in charge. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that there was a fate worse than being hung, drawn and quartered, and this is it. You've probably heard of the wheel, but there's quite a few variations on how it was actually used, like you would be dragged over flames as the wheel turns and so on, but this method I'm about to tell you is honestly one of the worst things I've ever read. Basically, they would tie you to the side of the wheel, not the edges, so that you'd be lying on your back with all your limbs outstretched. Then they would drag you in front of a crowd and take a large mallet with which to smash all of your limbs to pieces, as well as your hips and a few ribs. They would then take your broken, shattered legs and arms, untie them, wrap them around the spools of the wheel, and then tie them again, so that you were just left in this kind of broken, twisted, pretzel-like shape. Then they'd raise the wheel upright so that you were essentially kind of crucified as your broken body was just kind of left to rot in whatever excruciating position you were tied in. There were records of people surviving up to 9 days in this state, and they just essentially died of dehydration. Since all of their major organs were still okay, they're just left in an absolute agony and unable to move. I personally think of all the ways to die throughout history, this one is probably the worst because of the extreme pain you would endure, the public humiliation, the mutilation of your body, which you can see in real time, and the fact that this could take over a week to actually kill you. Ugh. So yeah, even though medieval punishments at this time were a bit exaggerated, these kind of punishments like the wheel are way more harsh than the kinds of things that you see today, and they were used. So even if it's not quite as bad as we sometimes imagine it to be, or quite as common as we imagine it to be, it was still really violent. Torture, for instance, was a feature of the legal system, and it was used to extract confessions. Capital punishment, of course, did exist, and sometimes in these horrifying ways. Despite all this though, violence and torture couldn't just be used willy-nilly, and the court needed a really good reason to use these methods, and they needed to be absolutely certain that they had caught the right culprit before they could actually do anything. In order to be executed on the wheel, like we just mentioned, you would need to be guilty of something really, really bad, like multiple murders or treason, and they'd need to be 100% sure that you were guilty of it before anything like this could actually be done. To give you an example of how limited these powers of violence and execution were, we'll look at a slightly less serious crime, adultery. In medieval France, if you suspected your spouse was having an affair, you would need to catch them in the act. But not just you. You'd also need 2 judges to be eyewitnesses to them going at it. And this way, it was completely beyond doubt that they were guilty. And then finally, your spouse could be punished. And the punishment was actually non-lethal, and instead it would be a form of social humiliation in which the 2 people having the affair would be tied naked back to back and ridiculed by onlookers. In a world where everyone knows each other, this would have been a big deal, as your chances of having a decent and respectable life after this public shaming would now be much lower. So even in the cases where the punishment isn't particularly violent, everyone still had to be absolutely sure that someone was guilty, even requiring 2 judges to be eyewitnesses to the crime. Of course, in more serious cases like murder or treachery, where you couldn't expect an eyewitness to also be a judge, it became even more important to make sure that you had established someone's guilt before you punished them. Since, the punishment for murder could be the wheel, whereas the punishment for adultery was just public humiliation. Violent or not, the one thing that remains consistent is you need to make sure that you are punishing the right person. So, in order to actually punish someone, you still needed to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt, just like today. And this is where we start to see torture as a feature of medieval law and order. See, in these times, before the trial could begin, the defendant would have to enter a plea. They'd have to say whether they're guilty or not guilty. Without this plea, the legal trial couldn't start, which created an easy exploit for anyone who was actually guilty. All they had to do was refuse to enter a plea either way, and they could stall the legal process at the first hurdle. The workaround, however, was that the court could take you outside and torture you until you pled guilty or not guilty. If you were innocent, all you needed to do is plead not guilty and the trial would immediately begin. If you were guilty, you had to decide if you were going to endure the torture and maybe get away with it, or plead not guilty and hope the court finds you innocent. It's not perfect, but considering the limitations of the time, it's a fairly sophisticated way to encourage people to participate in the legal system. And encourage people it did. One of these torture methods was crushing people, where they would put a stone in the small of your back and then a wooden plank on top of that stone. And then they would add more and more weights to the plank. If you refused to speak up, you would start to suffer under the immense weight. Sometimes up to 400 kilograms would be placed onto a football-sized stone balanced onto the small of your spine. Your limbs would slip out of their sockets with a sickening crack. Organs would start to be displaced and ruptured, leading to internal bleeding and, of course, organ failure. Your ribs would break and collapse onto themselves, causing your chest to flatten, which of course would make breathing impossible. And finally, your spine would break, leaving you paralysed on the exact spot that your torment began. One of the victims of this was Lady Margaret Clitheroe in 1586. She had pretty good social status at the time. She was a lady, which is important because people who were higher up the social ladder would be kind of exempt from this kind of torture. But Clitheroe was under suspicion of illegally harbouring some Catholic priests, and at the time this was a very serious crime. And so the court needed her to make a plea so that they could go to trial, and she refused to give them one. Eventually, it was decided that torture was going to be the only way to move proceedings along, but nobody dared to put a noble woman under this kind of ordeal. Every professional executioner and lawman flat out refused to take part in the torture of this lady. So, the court went out to find some local homeless beggars and paid them an obscene amount of money, essentially a bribe, to crush her until she spoke up. And of course, they accepted. These knuckleheads then broke into her house and ripped off her front door to use as the plank across her back. They had no idea what they were doing and ended up crushing her to death before she was able to give a confession, killing her alongside with her unborn baby. Yep, she was pregnant. It was an enormous scandal and a huge embarrassment for the courts. It sounds like a classic case of medieval brutality to us, but people at the time were furious about this wanton use of violence. Like always, justice is never perfect because the real world is a complicated place, and these cases of arbitrary violence stick out like a sore thumb in the annals of history precisely because of how rare they are. In reality, even torture to force someone to enter a plea was rare, since most people knew they'd be tortured if they refused to go along with the court and just decided to give their answer first rather than, do things the hard way. All of this means that the only time that torture was used is for the worst crimes like murder, fraud, and heresy, because if you were found guilty of these crimes, your punishment would be horrific, and you might have better luck just trying to endure the torture. So, like all the horrific punishments we've seen so far, torture was also a pretty rare occurrence and only for the nastiest elements of society. But even if torture, capital punishment, and public execution were all rare, they were still features of justice back then, which don't exist today. We don't do that stuff anymore, most of the time. So things definitely have come a long way since the medieval period, which means we haven't answered our original question. Why do we see this kind of brutality back then and not today? What's changed? And honestly, it's mainly due to the improvement of our law enforcement than it is to do with anything else. See, today we have DNA evidence, professional detectives, CCTV surveillance, interrogation techniques based off of psychological research, and all this really cool stuff that makes finding criminals kind of easy. Of course, it's not always a walk in the park, but in general, it's a lot harder to get away with crime today than it used to be. So today, when we catch a criminal, we give them a measured punishment like some time behind bars, and justice is done. The person who broke the law spends time in prison, away from society, where they go without their freedom and have the time to reflect and reform before re-entering society once they are no longer a danger to themselves or others. Today, our punishments are about protecting the community and giving the offender a chance at rehabilitation. At least that's how it should work on paper. The reality is that it's a totally different story, and we've got a whole video on that topic if you're curious. But in the medieval era, people didn't have CCTV, of course, they didn't have detectives, they didn't have knowledge of DNA or any of the amazing tools that we use today, which means it was really, really hard to catch a criminal and then be absolutely sure this was your guy. And even when you were almost certain, the legal system was a bit rough around the edges, which meant that establishing guilt was a really, really difficult process, and lots of people basically ended up getting away with crime, even if they were guilty, just because there was a lack of solid evidence. All of this meant that when the court could finally be sure that they had the right guy, this was their one chance to issue a punishment for the crime, and they took full advantage of it. And that's why the sentences seem so harsh to us today. It was less about serving the perfect amount of justice to one guilty individual, and more about showing everybody else that justice was being done. This very public and very violent form of justice created an atmosphere of deterrence. Even if there was a high likelihood that you could get away with doing bad things, if on the off chance you were caught, then your punishment was going to be a world of pain and public humiliation. And so maybe you're better off just following the rules. And that's the difference. If you can't catch everyone, you make an example of the people you can catch, and you use justice as a deterrent. In short, today we can afford to take a stance of rehabilitation, but back then, the emphasis was on deterrence. And that's why medieval punishment was so brutal. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed this episode of Flashback, and for more history and history of ideas, don't forget to subscribe. I've been Jake, and cheers.